Taken from the philosophical magazine Philosophy Now. In paragraph 11 of Experience, Emerson's narrator realizes that in order to find peace, he must abandon the impetus to construct the rational system, since life is not dialectics. Thinking about life limits one's capacity to live it. So the narrator stops searching for a philosophical order to life and enjoys the present. To finish the moment, to find the journey's end in every step of the road, to live the greatest number of good hours is wisdom. Some truths rumble too deep, beyond the range of words and rational thought, verging upon the nature of existence itself. Whenever a philosopher makes a statement about an ethical or unethical action, they are assuming that man has some sort of ability to do actions, and that man has the time to do those actions. Time, a rather abstract concept, is only analyzed dialectically through great difficulty. Therefore, it behooves one to use every tool at disposal to explore and perhaps cast some light on the nature of time in relation to human existence. This is honestly the best explanation I can give of the words I am about to share. For truly, I believe that poets make not the best, but definitely the most honest philosophers. Living seeks for something beyond itself, something other, something completely foreign to us. Some think their way towards this end, and some feel and think their way towards this end. Rhetoric may be full of great bombast, and dialectic may be very useful in analysis, but to put a deep line of demarcation between the two simply kills all the fun. Thus, you will find that the work to follow is a strange mixture of dialectic and rhetoric, possessing levels of analysis along with words meant to stir the maelstrom of the human soul. Some parts even verge on the didactic. I do not make any claims to mastery of the three styles, and beg the patience of the gracious listener in the work to follow. The dramatis personae, if you pardon such verbiage, are the following: the preacher, the farmer, referred to as the learned one, the serf, the prince, the merchant, the scholar, and the one. Ultimately, one will invariably find things in this work with which they take offense, and similarly things with which they wholeheartedly agree. Let it be known this author cares very little for the criticisms of his detractors and very little for the accolades of his supporters. Not to say that I do not care for the people making the criticism or the accolade, for truly, for such was this written. I merely state that the pastoral purpose dictates that which I have written, namely the salvation of man, the opening of eyes to beauty, and the condemnation of all puristically natural views of the world. For as has been previously said, some truths stumble upon eternity unknowingly and fall short of explanation. I urge you to come with me in this exploration, and perhaps we shall find something useful. Therefore, if any gain is to be apprehended, it seems right to call upon the eudaimonia, the good indwelling spirit, to imbue the words of my discourse and the speaking of my mouth in this moment with the grace of enlightenment, that both my detractors and my supporters may find something with which to better their lives. Let us begin. In the beginning, God spoke in simple, thunderous tones to create the cosmos, both visible and invisible, casting the stars into the sky and bringing life from out the deeps of chaos. 6 days he did his work of creation. Then on the seventh he rested. If time were to exist for an infinite being such as God in the same way it exists for humanity, it would best be expressed in the number 7, denoting simplicity, fullness, and a sense of heavenly perfection. The divine mover's time being fully utilized, he allowed time for rest at the completion of his majestic work. Aside from the quaintness of this story for many of ostentatious intelligence, there exist deep fundamental truths in stories of this quality, truths which the humble may receive. To tell the truths held in the seemingly simple frameworks of Genesis would take the duration of all human lifetimes since the beginning of human lifetimes. For truly divine truth never reaches its bottom, and the breadth, length, and depth thereof astound human understanding. Within the bounds of this simple treatise on time, I do not seek to pigeonhole him for whom, through whom, and by whom all things exist and have their being. Rather, I seek to draw parallels to the divine use of time, such that humans may more effectively use the time allotted to them in their brief days under the sun. For truly, from out the brevity of human life comes the utter necessity of such a treatment. Finally, if my labors prove not in vain, perhaps the sorrow allotted to man, not being necessarily entirely removed, may at least find a resolution in the surrender of the individual to a cause that transcends the bounds of time itself. With my method of thought established, it seems best to begin with definitions. The word time is used in many senses in modern life. One might say, I do not have time to do this or that, or they may say, it did not happen because it just was not the right time. Both of these sentences convey two different perceptions of time. One, the former, seems to carry the presupposition that some human error leads to a lack of time to finish the given task, while the other carries a tenor of fatalism. In fact, the latter could be said another way. Time did not allow this to happen. Each of these sentences is indicative of the varied avenues of human perception in relation to time. The question we must ask as those who seek to live beautifully is which of these avenues of perception is more helpful? Furthermore, one might ask, which of these avenues of perception is truer? But any good philosopher knows that the pure rational truth is not always the most helpful thing for human life and flourishing. Therefore, we will leave the question of truth entirely alone and seek to answer the question, which of these avenues is most helpful for beautiful living? From this consideration, we will derive a general definition for the sake of inquiry. In the following scene, the preacher has rested by the road and observed the farmer completing his day's labor in a field of barley. He offers the farmer a cool drink and then engages him in conversation. Time, the mistress of all great ones, the true wealth of the rich, the fountain of opportunity, says the preacher. In response, the learned one. How can time be considered wealth or even an opportunity? For time flows on whether or not we ask it to do so. It defies all command and resists all attempts against its fortified citadel. It ultimately is the victor in the game called life. In all things, time remains while the lives of many great men have ceased. Time endlessly flowing. Time the ever exalted one. Time, the great equalizer of humanity. Quite simply, the preacher responds, you have confused time with eternity, my son. Eternity's citadel verily hath not been breached, never, by philosopher, preacher, prophet, or king. Eternity stands apart from man as the stars are apart from earth. Eternity rises out of sight past the clouds until it reacheth heaven itself, perhaps even beyond heaven itself. Yet time is a woman of these things in the here and now, a simple woman of dignity. She knows her end and quietly serves her purpose. Lady Time opens her gates to all who respect her power and give her due consideration. Thus the teaching, time, the mistress of all great ones, the true wealth of the rich, the fountain of opportunity. In response, the learned one speaks, yet does not man seek eternity? If time be the mistress, let eternity be the queen. My son, soon you will learn to concern yourself with the things within your grasp, for those things within the grasp of man are but little, and to seek beyond these is to seek toilsome labor and pain. Yet the divine has seen fit to place things within your grasp that lead to eternity, the queen of which you speak. What things are these, teacher? Namely, time enough to change your inner being, time enough to catch a glimpse of the constellations of truth, time enough to breathe the clear air of creation while you await the divine judgment. For truly, such things are all that man has been given in this brief hour under the sun. What you say rings true in my ears, yet eternity is superior, and all that I seek. If seek you the Queen of Heaven, eternity, robed in splendor, then walk with me in the paths of this teaching. For after some wondering, doubtless we shall find such an answer as is good for us. Will you accompany me? I will. And so they walked and talked together. The preacher and the learned one walked and talked of the cool of the evening together, while the sun kissed the horizon in golden hues before disappearing beyond human sight. The wind lightly tossed the barley fields in which they found themselves, a broad expanse of gold to match the colors of the sunset in the distance. How may man rise above this shell of mortality? Is there not a way to find the Queen of Heaven seated upon her throne? Such are the questions of a young man full of sentimentality. The preacher began. Concern yourself with living well now, while youth and vigor fill your limbs. Once a man sought for the kingdom of El Dorado, a city of wealth and riches. He wandered through darkest jungles of disease and death, longing for his prize. Some claim he found it, but the wise know that if such a kingdom had truly been found, not an enterprising soul would have neglected to leave their native lands to seek and divide such treasure. In response, the learned one, very well. Let us lay down your premise of the present world being of more importance. Still, how does the Lady Time influence this story you tell? Tell me, learned one, what things do most men seek in life? Things that seem entirely beyond reach, or things within their reach, things they may use? Doubtless, men seek those things which they feel to be useful and reachable. And no man would seek something which he knew was entirely out of his reach, beyond his control? That would follow. However, you have yet to define what you mean by that word, seeking. So you lead us to the heart of it, learned one, responded the preacher with some approval. A man seeks after Lady Time to help him put his house and soul in order before the day of judgment. He seeks Lady Time to assist in preparing for the day of death, to prepare his children for a life of wisdom, to prepare for the journey to the shores of heaven itself. Yet think you that these be the only manifestations of Lady Time? Somewhat dejectedly the learned one responded, Verily, you mistakenly ask this poor farmer such a question. Such questions seem to be the domain of princes and kings, not that of simple men. Oh, nay, my son, for remember to the beginning. You will realize that Lady Time truly opens her doors to all who do her honor and homage. On the contrary, Lady Time has elevated farmers to the throne of kings, and thrown kings to the stool of serfdom. Behold yonder plough. Tell me, what ends do you accomplish with it? Or rather, what is its use? With it I prepare the soil of my fields for tilling, dispense any nutriment the soil lacks, and help the soil acquire life from sun and water. So you consider the use of the plough essential to life, not only the life of all things, but most essentially your life, and that of your entire household. You have spoken truly. And the soil of your fields, they remain mere potentiality if unplowed or untilled. Yes, but I fail to see your meaning. Imagine time itself were like a field, waiting for the farmer to sow barley in it. The farmer has tools at his disposal, and time gives back tenfold for every hour of labor the farmer invests in his field. Do you follow this reasoning? And now you speak in common terms. Say on. What is more, imagine every human a farmer, given a field in which they may sow what seeds they will. It is not possible to overstate time as a field ready for plowing and tilling. Most men allow Lady Time to order their household when truly Lady Time waits and seeks after a word from such men as know their desired estate and end of life. Are you accustomed to seeing your allotted days in such a light? I cannot say that I've seen existence in such terms. And man has complete power to sow such seeds that he may will and work toward whatever ends he wills. The only limit to man is his own lack of propensity to dream and desire, my son. These days under the sun are truly few and brief, but they are a gift beyond measure. To waste them away in idleness and unprofitable leisure is a great tragedy. Yet now I get ahead of myself. Behold, yon sun has hidden behind the western hills. Let us away to my abode and rest. Perhaps we shall talk more, or perhaps we shall sleep. Yes, let us away." And they continued their exploration as they walked, the sun now gone to bed, and the sky ablaze with innumerable stars, like pinpricks of light in a great black curtain cast by some giant. The night was clear and cool, a night of dreams and delight. The flaming light of day gave way to the beauty of darkness, and our friends ventured on deeper still in their journey of words and thoughts. A while later, after a good meal and a draught of mead, the farmer and the preacher continued their discussion by the fire in the warmth of the preacher's abode. "It seems worthwhile to explain these metaphors of yours, preacher, for metaphors allow for ease of interpretation and varied application." "What do you mean, speaking exactly by such ideas as fields ready to plow and till? Again, I pray you, speak clearly," spoke the learned one, with some weariness evident in his limbs after a day in the fields. The preacher gazed into the embers of the fire that now began to burn low, and after some thought spoke. "Few men care enough to truly understand, and therefore they allow poetic speech to wash over them with little thought. Consequently, they neglect to put such a question as you have put to me just now. As I am a preacher, my communication is often in the form of a parable. Yet, for the sake of clarity, I will drop such pretense to speak clearly to you with real-world examples." The learned one nodded his assent with approval. "Have you often gone to the cities of the East?" inquired the preacher. "Verily, I go there once every fortnight to sell anything no longer of use and put aside some profit for future security." "Do you mean to begin some moral diatribe?" said the learned one inquisitively. "Nay, I simply seek to show how some men use their time more effectively than others. I once met a man in one of these eastern cities who began every day when the sun was high in the sky. Once the day was begun, he broke his fast with some alacrity, and ensued his day's labor, the balancing of accounts in the office of the publicans. The job demanded little, and gave him much mental space when his gentle day of labor was at an end. What would you do with such freedom of mind and liberty of hours, my friend?" "It seems I would use the surplus of time and energy to do some work of great worth, perhaps towards my future, or possibly the future of my household." "You have spoken well, learned one." But that was not this man's answer. He spent his time in no activity of blatant debauchery or even a lower-level vice, yet he did not pursue the things you just mentioned. Can you venture a guess at what this man prioritized in his own time? If he did not pursue debauchery or some sin, perhaps he sought after some useless endeavor? Well said, indeed. This man, who we will pitifully dub the serf, devoted his time to things of no earthly, or for that matter, even otherworldly use. He downed a draught of wine at the local establishment after labor, engaged in some meaningless jesting with some acquaintances, returned home, kissed his wife once or twice, and then retired to his library to absent-mindedly read some book on the vanity of existence. Granted, an existence sought after by most and dubbed the middle class, but a vain one nonetheless, ended the preacher with some finality. "I thought you said you would spare me from a moral diatribe," said the learned one jocundly. "Being a preacher requires me to say certain things," said the preacher with a half-smile before continuing. The serf spent all of his days doing enough to satisfy the bare requirements of hearth and home, dutifully follow the instructions of his superiors, and finally the silver cord snapped, and he passed from this world to the next. Few noticed he was gone, just as few noticed when he came. With some confusion, the learned one, "Yet many live their lives in this manner from start to finish. Truly you cannot find fault with this man's simple existence. Do you call his existence simple? Verily, the fact that most carry their lives forward in this manner does not make it helpful or simple. You have yet to delineate the nature and essence of his failings. Say on." "Very well. Let us return to our earlier idea of time bearing fruit for its possessor. Returning to this idea will show us just how careless this man was with his days. Do you ever allow your fields to lie dormant beyond the natural fallow period? Nay, to do such things would set back my labors a decade or more. Truly, in the same way, the serf's days bore little fruit to him or anyone around him. Had this man no ends after which he sought? Inquired the learned one. A man such as yourself understands that a life is much like a cultivated field and must bear fruit. This man considered life as carelessly as a child its first plaything. This is not to say that he had no aims in life, but that he never prioritized those aims above the prioritization of a comfortable, safe existence, an existence with just enough vice to be exciting, just enough virtue to stay the voice of conscience. When he might have influenced his household towards goodness, his influence was nowhere to be found. When he might have sought after a more meaningful labor, he allowed comfort and fear to stay his course. When he might have grown in passionate love for the wife of his youth, he was more in love with the wine bottle, not to excess, but enough to blunt his natural wildness. When he might have embarked upon some great mission to change the very nature of his city, he passed over those thoughts and returned to the task at hand, never to be a bother over much. To some, a man of moderation, great inner harmony and peace, a seeker of the mean. But we know better. Life consists of manifold sacred moments, simple, small moments, where the very course of existence may change for the better. A life spent sacrificing and devouring these sacred moments results in a sacrificed and devoured life. Seemingly perplexed, the learned one questions still further. There are truths to be learned here, and I realize we must plumb still deeper. Had this man no love in his being at all? This brings us to the crux of the issue at hand. The serf had no love, not even truly for himself. Bereft of passion, he used the sacred moments of his life for neither good nor ill, and talking about him incessantly chills the very flame of my inner being. Let us move on to another example. I present to you the life of the prince, another man from one of these eastern cities. This man was also known to you, more than known, for I brought him up in the teaching from his youth, considered him a son reckoned with my own flesh and blood. Will you hear more, or does the call of sleep overwhelm your senses? I fear the needs of my body drown out the deep desire of my mind and soul. Let us continue tomorrow morning. Very well, then. We shall continue at the rooster's first cry. Midnight struck as the two friends released themselves to the arms of sleep and dreams. The wind blew against the abode of the preacher, and the last embers of the fire were extinguished in a single instant, as if a spirit had flown precipitously from the peak of a mountain, landing in the house itself. Smoke filled the abode, and with an active mind the farmer dreamed. First he saw a herd of cattle, fat and slow, trudging through a field towards a pit full of fire, out of which were heard pained screams of torment. The herd was led by what appeared to be shepherds. Instantly his view changed, and he saw a blood-soaked feasting hall with a crowd of kings gathered round the feasting table in a regal array. They turned and looked at him as one, aware of his presence, smiled as one, with inhuman synchronization. Their fangs were stained with blood. Instantly he fell, swallowed by the earth itself, traveling at the speed of a demon cast from heaven. Last he stood on the spire of the tallest cathedral in the city and beheld the marketplace, brimming with life as some great hive of termites. Dark roots spread from the palace out to the fields, where the herd was lit ablaze, and the roots spread to the city itself, where the noise of the marketplace grew louder and louder, till it sounded as the pit had sounded, the cry of merchants exchanged for screams of torment and fear. A clap of thunder, and the farmer awoke. The night of dreams gave way to a lovely, clear morning, tinged in hues of blue and pink, with thin veils of mist covering the barley fields in a soft blanket of moisture. Gradually, the sun rose over the fields and dispelled the mists of morn. The mist over the heart and mind of the learned one remained, with many burning questions and dark thoughts of doom. Your countenance bears the furrows and shadow of a man twice your years, O learned one. Whither went your soul this past night? Questioned the preacher. With some trepidation, the learned one attempted to recount the details of the dream before they faded from waking memory. Everything I saw was clear then, but now surrounded by fog. Yet the impressions contained therein remain with me. A dark maw opening upon the visible world, swallowing all meaning and life, illuminating sources of evil and eliciting screams of horror. These things have to do with the nature of existence, deep things, deeper meanings. Still, the very nexus of the truth evades me. The voice of the learned one trailed off, and his gaze reached off far into the distance, seeming to search for some visible sign to return the dream to full recollection. Mayhaps continuing our discourse will jolt the details of your dream into memory, posited the preacher. Again the learned one nodded his assent, unable to speak for distraction, and the preacher began once more. Once upon a time, I was the chief of the counselors to the king of a nation in the east. The old king was so in awe of my wisdom that he made me the teacher of his household. All servants received their education from me, as well as all of his own children, who were numerous. Perhaps the most promising youth I ever met and had the chance to teach was a youth by the name of Alcibiades, a youth with great physical beauty, a ready intellect, and a quick understanding of the oracles. Never before had I seen a youth with his promise. I observed his movements from the days he was a mere swaddling, bouncing upon his mother's knee, to the day he rode, with the king's own guard against the men of the north. By then he had become a mighty warrior, with an even mightier mind, terrible to face in combat, and capable of stratagems to baffle generals twice his age. From his youth up, I taught him the divine oracles, which he memorized readily when his powers of cognition began to come of age. He often would quote them in the religious assembly, when most simply took the oracle scroll and read aloud from it at the beginning of worship. As his teacher, I could only stand aside with great pride and hope. Pride in his victories, and hope that none of my fears and darkest thoughts would ever come to pass. For men of great talents and abilities can do great good or great harm. I prayed for such for years, as I watched him mature. For a time it seemed he would be a king 10 times the degree of his father, exceeding him in wisdom, martial might, and religiosity. After a number of years his father died, and after the time of mourning was observed, one of his brothers rose up against the kingdom with an army of traitors, in an attempt to usurp the rightful kingship from Alcibiades. Alcibiades rallied the king's own guard, seasoned veterans one and all, and met his brother on the plains in sight of the very gates of the city, where he easily smote his brother's army into great ruin, confusion, and disarray. I rode with him past the heaps of corpses to greet the captured and cowed younger brother, a lad of merely 14, saw the rage rise in Alcibiades' eyes, and witnessed him dismount, drawing his sword. Although I counseled the rightful king that mercy becomes the divine ruler, and to remember his own flesh and blood, he grasped his brother by the scalp, and hewed his head from off his shoulders. Witness the fate of traitors to the crown, be they blood relative or sworn enemy, roared Alcibiades with thunderous command, and his legions cried as one, "All hail the Red King." I could only watch my beloved pupil with horror, bathed in gore as he stood atop a mountain of corpses, with his brother's ghastly head in his hand, flinging it wildly into the air. After the battle, though slaughter may be a better word, I approached the king and prostrated myself, saying, "All hail! But does Alcibiades the Red suit your majesty's celebrated lineage of philosopher kings? Would not Alcibiades the Wise be a greater title, worthy of renown and honor? even love, from north to south, east to west. At that my pupil smiled, laughed, as if he was merely the child I knew, caught at the trick of a boy first gone to school, and said, "Oh, my friend, be reasonable. The sword work on the field today was merely an act to consolidate power in the crown. You need not fear your pupil becoming a wicked man. I only did that which best served the kingdom and its people." I witnessed his seamless transition from blood-crazed fiend to the gregarious man of the crowd, and realized in a single explosive instant the monster that stood before me. At that moment the learned one grasped with horror, visibly shuddered, with eyes aghast, as if scenes of death were playing out before him. "Your tale brings to mind a portion of my dream," said the learned one through clenched teeth. "I saw fangs, dripping with blood, but not the fangs of ravenous beasts, but of men. Men glorious to behold and kingly in bearing, standing in the chambers of power, having ended some great cannibalistic feast." The preacher responded with a question. "Do you have any sense as to what this image may mean?" "Verily, a sense of the meaning occurs to me after hearing a portion of your tale of woe," responded the learned one gravely. "Some men, having great prowess in all things and abilities to do great good, use their powers to wreak slaughter, devouring the people whom they should protect and guide. You have interpreted the image correctly, my son, and even more, you have verged upon things in my tale which I have yet to account, things more abominable than what you have heard as of yet. While my soul recoils, we must gaze into the abyss to master it. I pray you to continue." And so the preacher continued his tale. In the days of the council, the king maintained a demeanor of propriety in all things, showing mercy often, ruling with justice. For a while it truly seemed that the blood rage of the battlefield had merely carried him away in the early days of his rule. Often the king was seen praying, and he still stood in the assembly and quoted the oracles with great reverence. If things had gone on in this way, this tale might have ended in happiness. On the great day of feasting, instituted by the oracles from time immemorial, the king arose in the assembly and quoted with great passion, as was his wont, finished with the scroll, but neglected to return it to the shepherd of the people, which was in keeping with the custom. He remained upon the dais at the lectern and waited till all eyes and ears in the assembly were fixed upon him with immense anticipation. Thus spoke Alcibiades the Red, sovereign of the cities of the east and the southern isles, the third of his line in the final year of the council, the 12th year of his reign. "Behold, all ye people, this, the cathedral of beauty and splendor, enshrining the words of the One for all ages and all peoples, that all may come to knowledge of the truth, and observe how the One hath given unto us this, the oracle of his testimony," spake the prince, lifting aloft the oracle and continuing his iconoclastic speech. "Behold the grace and honor bequeathed to we, the people of the oracle. And behold all the more the mercy shown, in that we have been led by many a wise king prior to the present. Moreover, witness the majesty enshrined in the lineage of Alcibiades the Red, and how the One hath wisely granted the kingship to the line that most hallows his oracles. For verily you yourselves hath known how my grandfather and his father before him have taken great pains to commit the oracles to memory, till they themselves were considered by some to be prophets of the One himself. For as the prophet says, Blessed be the one that keepeth thy words in remembrance to also do them, and even more, blessed be the house whose God is the one, to whom he shall not impute wrongdoing. And yet even more, blessed is the nation who flees from the evil way, oppression of the sojourner, worship of the abominable, and pleasures of spirits. But yet hath not the oracles also said, In the last days it shall come to pass that a king shall rule wisely, and his rule will cover the earth as waters cover the sea. And in another place thine eyes shall behold the king in his beauty. And still more, the king which hearkeneth unto thy law shall be called ruler of nations. All ye people, this day witness the fulfillment of prophecy. Witness the ascension of this thy nation to the status of the blessed ones, the very sons of God. Witness the ascension of thy king, who hath loved thee as the one loves his own, to the status of shepherd of the people. For hath not the oracle said, and the king shall stand as shepherd of the people, and the word of thy law shall be in his mouth? And with that, Alcibiades the Red quoted the oracle from the first line to last, while the assembly sat in awe and enrapturement. The sun set and rose again, while still the people sat transfixed. Finally, at the 12th hour of the following day, the king finished his work with the final line of the oracle. And they shall no longer kill or destroy on all of my holy mountain, neither shall death be any longer. And he shall wipe away tears from every eye, for sorrow and sighing will be no more. At this many wept with joy and delight to hear the oracles spoken with such faith and deified essence. But the aged and wise amongst the assembly wept aloud, and rent their clothes that they should live to see such days. For the abomination of desolation had come. Again the learned one cried aloud, but this time in greater horror, saying, I saw a fiery pit full of unspeakable terrors, from which emitted screams of terror, and leading the herd to the pit for slaughter were the shepherds themselves. For the first time, a tear streaked the grizzled cheek of the preacher, but he responded with care and poise. You have witnessed perhaps the greatest of the evils of this age. The shepherds themselves, the keepers of the testimonies, and now finally the ruler of the world who quickens them all, lead the people to perdition and confusion beyond all repair. How could such things be? Cried the learned one on the verge of despair. Recall to mind our earlier example of the field ready to plow and till. Quite simply, the prince of this world used time in such a way that he reaped the harvest of what he had so long sown in quietness for many years. None of us knew until that fateful day of feasting. But then it became all too clear. But how could one possess the deepest of knowledge of the oracles, a lineage bathed in the grace of divinity, and still commit such abominations? Would not the oracles themselves rage against these actions within the mind of the person in question? No doubt they did for some time. But having set an end of every action, the prince pursued his ends to the point of obsession, till the very words of the oracles could only speak of him, his attainment of empire, which he has since achieved and continues to propagate in the world against all good. There have been countless many like him, perhaps many more yet shall come. So it seems that the bulk of the prince's wrongdoing was unobservable wrongdoing within the inner sanctum of his mind and soul, wrongdoing in the halls of thought, wrongdoing in the veins of desire. How did the prince come to achieve empire? And did his actions have any negative effect on the cities of the East? All this will become clear in time, my son. Next, let us consider the use of the time of the merchant who lived in the city of which we have spoken and bore witness to much of the atrocities we have covered. Very well. Perhaps the rest of my dream will come to light. Perhaps. At this point, I'm going to skip what I had planned to say about the merchant and the scholar. Two other characters in the drama. If you want to see that, you need to read on the blog. For now, I'm going to skip ahead to the section titled The Bondage of Man, and we'll get this done in interest of time. Yet is it not understood that if the rains not come, my fields will wither away and perish? If the winds blow harshly from the east, my crops will die or catch the plague, Moreover, if the serf had not been born into his status of life and profession, may he not have also been a prince or a preacher? May he not have lived differently if he'd been driven to do so? I truly see the wisdom in what you say, and pray you to continue, replied the preacher. With barely a pause, the learned one continued his soliloquy. If the sun destroy itself in a blaze of cosmic destruction, it will not rise upon my field, and the plants shall perish. If my body, by some stroke of misfortune, fall ill or receive malady, none will remain to cultivate the fields. If the great swarm of locusts, blocking out the light of the sun, descend from the eastern steppes, my fields will be devoured and ruined. Some say man has tamed nature ever and anon, but as the truth to which I have borne witness shows, the strength of man pales before the gargantuan heft of nature. Verily, nature may crush man at its whim. What may stay these disasters from occurring perplexes man, for he is keenly aware of his inability to establish life and of the immense power of a maelstrom, blizzard, or starfall. What then is man's first cause? At its root, this truly is the only question ever asked by men such as yourself, preacher, or even by philosophers. If it be not nature, then it must be somewhat greater than nature. It seems foolish to conclude that things perishable may give birth to other perishable things infinitely, yet a human union forms such things, purportedly. So, we must dig still deeper into this conundrum. Perhaps it is right to conclude that nature itself is imperishable, giving birth to the perishable and sending the seed of its fertility out into every corner of the cosmos. Still, fewer ask, what is nature, and whence comes its nearly divine status? And, if truly divine in essence, how is it that it hath parts that wither and fade? Stars perish, galaxies drift apart, things die everywhere. Something within bemoans the utter wrongness of this fact. Truly, why must nature herself be subject to such ravishing by death? Yet this fact proves one thing. It is absurd beyond all ken to say that nature is the mother of all things, for things perishable always have a beginning and give birth to other perishable things. Such things cannot logically contribute to ultimate origins. In this light, man's role as a child of Mother Nature, whether true or untrue, is unimportant, for it seems necessary that nature herself had one whom breathed upon her to give her life in days of yore, one who now watches, orchestrates, and brings into being from nothing. The precipitous end of all human intelligence at the point of origins is perhaps the most profound proof of the need for divinity, and at the very least something infinite, to truly explain, describe, and prove. Witness the laws of the scholar. The question will always remain, no matter the ostentation of man's mind to answer otherwise. From whence came such and such a thing? If man continues on this line of inquiry, he stumbles upon a rule. Something infinite must necessarily lie at or near the point of origins. Furthermore, if man sunders himself from his first cause, yea, if he cut the tree of human thought off at the roots, he begets death and destruction within and without, such that no human action may lead to the good, and every human thought falters and dies at the foot of insanity. Witness Nietzsche. Truly, you have learned more than I ever could have thought to teach from our discourse. For men are truly carried on to speak from the good indwelling spirit. I pray you, continue, the preacher exclaimed. Having considered the world without, we have yet to shine the light of reason on man's inner being. You have spoken of man's ability to pursue actions and achieve ends in the highest of terms, O preacher, yet neglect to admit that often man's deepest desires and noblest ends remain unachieved, unperformed, and at worst scarcely even manifested. The only question a sane man can ask at the sight of such a tragedy and deep abomination is why? If man, having every intention towards the good, with all the endowment of divine beauty and investment, still falters before reaching the prize, what good then is man? Is there any goodness within him truly? Is a good end unrealized even indicative of a good man? While your discourses sought to establish the power of man within the fields of time, I feel quite to the contrary, that man is powerless before the ironclad advance of causality. The way his existence is begun, being quite beyond his power or choice, will similarly yield a chain of events, commonly known as a life, which will also be quite beyond his power, having once been begun in a certain fashion. Inevitably, the next question breaks like ocean waves upon the shoals. Whence comes happiness if man, being unable to change his course, fails at every turn to apply the actions necessary for his ends? Must then a single man ever be happy and fulfilled? But then that leaves us asking, what is happiness? And most say the force of will to achieve ends, assuming those ends be in line with the good. Yet we have established that man has no power to establish ends in line with the good, as your tales have shown, and to the truth of which my own simple knowledge has attested. You speak of the importance of proper utilization of time, and in the next breath divulge another immense failure of humankind. How is it that time, being held in such importance by all, is elusive and unutilized in all of your examples? This truly seems simple. Man is without power in every circumstance, for his life will transpire in line with his predetermined course, having once been set from birth. The preacher made no move to speak, and continued listening intently to the farmer's oration. Finally, life drawing on to its close, man looks upon his life, a mangled heap of chance occurrence and unrealized potential, and laments the loss of it all. At this point, one cannot help but ask, is time even worth consideration? And eternity even attainable? For man cannot remedy his bound state, nor reach beyond that which he knows to attain the transcendent, for even his temporal tools are beyond his reach. To which I must say the following. A man must eat to live, and therefore a plow will always be needed to prepare the ground to grow nourishment for the hunger of man. However, the ends which one seeks will always be elusive, unless they are in keeping with the path laid out from the beginning. So, we are left in a quandary. Man, unable to achieve his ends, but still expected to propagate life abundantly, is cut adrift in the sea of time, paddling with free agency in whichever direction he chooses, but nevertheless at the mercy of the waves. And so the end of the matter. Life itself, being full of corruption, seeks to swallow man whole, and man is entirely helpless if his life bear not the good indwelling spirit. The farmer, having completed his oration, sat down and looked as if despair would swallow him whole. Finally, the preacher responded with care. I am but a lowly preacher, having led my congregation many a year, and many a wise scholar has propounded to me in a similar manner what you have said. But I ask you, what can a preacher say to a man raging headlong towards perdition but repent and flee your demise? Verily, in saying such a thing, assuming that he has that power, what can a preacher say to men who love mortal pleasures besides look? Behold the glorious heavens, and repent of your evil, still assuming that they even have their eyes after all. Verily, my son, the one hath not made all things known to man, and the plight must truly be as dire as you say. But still, the one hath found the place for the work of a mere preacher amid such darkness, and yea, the work of a farmer amidst the turbulence of nature. Man must not lament being cut adrift in the seas of time, but be grateful to have a little bark on which to float in the first place. For to think otherwise would end in death to man's hope. From this starting point, engage in yes-saying to the life decreed. Pursue your ends that seek after the good, and remember the one. For such is all the duty of man. With the preacher's last words, a bell tolled, and time was no more. Like some great subterranean boom in dwarven tunnels, the end rang. Thus spoke the deity from out the halls of bliss, and rent the curtain of time in two. Time receded into the minds of men as a distant memory, and eternity stepped off her throne of gold, raised her milk-white hand, and all the labors and fretting of the wise stood still. Every mouth was stopped, and all could do naught but look and wonder. Come, my friends, let us away to welcome the sons of God to the age of eternity, spoke the one with regal grace as he embarked on the stage of his mighty chariot. His brothers behind him smiled at the knowledge of great victory, raised their horns to hail the watchman, and the gates of heaven opened. As a flame from heaven rode the chariots of the one in resplendent majesty. The halls of heaven echoed with the rumbling wheels of the mighty Exodus, while the host of heaven gave a stupendous shout of triumph and joy to see the chariots of the one arrayed in such beauty. Never was there a day like this day. But then day and night were no more. Verily, to speak of them to the sons of God in this new age stirs the memory only vaguely. Upon a grassy knoll sat the learned one, in awe of the host of heaven, but most of all of the one. And away down the hill a cry of delight and greeting reached his ears. What ho there, learned one, and well met! The learned one gazed down the sunny banks of the hill, and behold, one whom he had not seen since the age of time. The preacher, now bedecked in a kingly robe, presented by the one in person. With shining face and light feet, the learned one ran to greet his bosom friend, laughing a laugh of freedom and joy. He embraced the preacher and said, What light now shines effulgently from you, my brother? The preacher responded, And from you. Having seen the most beautiful, it would only follow that it would be so. And so the two friends, reunited, made their way together to the hall of feasting and merriment, side by side, pace by pace, as they did long ago in the fields of barley, in the age of time. So walked they to the palace of the one, where feasting, revelry, and joy had their home and source. The stars themselves stood still. The sun ceased to set, and earth slackened in its orbit till it ceased entirely. Let time end, and the labors thereof, spoke deity with thunderous tone, as once they spoke in the beginning, giving birth to Lady Time, in the days where chaos pranced before the thrones of the gods, and they looked and took pleasure. So it was that Time bowed, and took her place in the void, a noble purpose complete, and a noble end granted. Then spoke the One. Let there be new things, things of light and beauty and perfection. And it was so. Selah. Epilogue. In retrospect, I implore the gracious listener to listen yet a little more as I delineate what ideas between both of the sources were given some treatment in the monologue. Aquinas and Aristotle both discussed happiness as the good. Aristotle leaves happiness somewhat vague and undefined, while Aquinas takes it a step further and calls it something similar to the highest contemplation of divinity. Both seem to agree that happiness consists in a sort of activity, but for one, ethical action, the mean between right and wrong, is the definition of happiness, while for the other, the inner sanctum of the mind most readily apprehends the good, which results in happiness. The former summarizes the position of Aristotle and might be subject to certain criticisms, namely, if virtue is merely the balance between two extremes, would it not be permissible to accept some evil in the soul? This idea was criticized in the section about the serf. Let the listener take that for what he will. In response to the monastic idea of Aquinas on happiness, the preacher proposes time as a field ready for plowing by man's free agency, casting light on time as the given for any ethical action to occur. Thus, the entire work could be taken as a criticism of Aquinas, for if we were all to fall in line with Aquinas' definition, we must all use our time to become monks and nuns. That seems rather absurd. Also, let the reader take that assertion for what he will. Further response was given to the ideas of the moral mean in the portrayals of the prince and the one. In keeping with certain religious tradition, it would be permissible to interpret the prince as the prince of this world or as an antichrist figure, the embodiment of pure evil, the response of hell to the person of Christ, and the closest possible imitation thereof. In my opinion, Aristotle's idea of morality lacks romance because it does not deeply discuss the nature of these extremes. In plumbing the depths of the abyss and gazing up into heaven, one will find they are equally deep and profound. Thus, I attempted to portray the prince and the one in striking similarity, both showing might and power, but both essentially opposed because of their chosen ends. Furthermore, it does not seem necessary to say this, but if it must be argued, allow that the existence of human ends argues for the existence of time and the intrinsic link between time and ethics. As human action possesses ends towards which it strives, so also must time have some sort of directionality. This is left purposely vague because this is not a scientific treatise, and only a scientific treatise could properly delineate the precise beginning and end of time. In the closing section, where the farmer embarks upon a soliloquy, unavoidable questions arise from the link between time and ethics. Determinism emerges as a potential problem for human action, and comes from the idea of the first cause in Aquinas. The first cause seems to dictate that nothing can exist outside of the chain of events decreed by the first cause, whatever it is, exactly. The farmer gives the metaphor of man paddling on a great ocean with immaculate free agency, but nevertheless at the mercy of the waves. In addition, the farmer weighs the ideas of the eternal universe as first cause, proposed by most Greek erudition as something without beginning, responding with the question, what is nature? This question possesses a few sub-questions underneath it in relation to the Greek argument, such as, what things do we include as a part of nature? Does one include the heavens, or merely things on earth? The farmer assumes the entire cosmos as being a part of nature and points out the problem of destruction, noting the destruction of stars, animals, humans, life in general, leaving the question, if the cosmos is some great eternal, why does it also fade and lose its splendor? Finally, the farmer asserts a rule. There seems to be no system of thought in existence that does not assume the existence of something infinite. That same infinite, whether in equation, God, or nature itself, being the first cause. To sunder men's mind from this rule has often driven men to insanity and hindered the very senses and perceptions of man from discerning anything worthwhile in existence. At this point, the farmer breaks the wall of reality once and only once with the words, "Witness Nietzsche." In the end, the preacher gives his final simple response. The response of a man who realizes that the deepest things of reality are so wonderful and grand, defying all description. He acknowledges the problems mentioned by the farmer and advocates for something resembling the words of the preacher in Ecclesiastes. The end of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for such is all the duty of man, and God will bring into judgment every secret thing, whether good or evil. Thus it is clear that only 2 of Aquinas' 5 proofs were considered in any way: first motion and first cause, with both being viewed in relation to time. But the nature of Aquinas' work is so broad and expansive that to take even 2 of his proofs and consider them is a difficult endeavor. Therefore, I beg the reader's pardon if they found this treatment to be merely cursory. Final thing, critical thought. I have one question for everyone. Is your time useful to you? And that is all I have to say in closing.
Is this where we start the grand ovation?
We have a new reigning king of longevity.
I'm sorry.
Don't have to apologize.
No, I don't think that was bad, that it was long at all, Brandon. It was long, but I think you brought it together very nicely, especially at the end. Can you repeat your critical thinking question one more time?
Is your time useful to you?
Cheers, Brandon. Took notes. First time I've done that in a meeting.
What is on your notes, Stephen? In general. As in, summarize your own notes.
Okay, well, I have 2 pages.
Ooh,
One page is a mind map, essentially.
a mind map?
Yeah, like a nodes of thoughts.
Oh, okay.
It linked in various ways. And then the next page was actually just stuff that I wanted to tell Brandon.
Oh, good.
I might
Good.
just do that, actually. I wrote down, you truly considered our texts and allowed them to touch your very self. And then the second thing was you expressed the turmoil of your growth with incredible art, resolution, and emotion. Because I just wanted to be sure that I told you that, Brendan.
Thank you for saying that. And, I'm not going to speak for a while now. At this point, the discourse is at your leisure. I have spoken way too much. That was way too long. I'm sorry. The only issue I had is that it was impossible to summarize everything because Aquinas is so long.
Yeah.
And the ethics is like literally everything having to do with human action, which is what we do every day. And just sitting here thinking and saying nothing is an action. So that's why it was so long. I wasn't trying to dominate the discussion, but
I don't think
Thank you.
anyone's thinking that.
No,
yeah,
I'm not.
yeah. Thank you for saying that, Stephen. So, thus the question: is your time useful to you? And I mean that in a moral sense. You can think of it from a self-help sense. How do you use your time? Do you think about time? Those are just a few subordinate things underneath the question.
So, in regards to the question, Brandon, you expect that the responses are going to be pretty individual, I suppose, but do they have to be specifically personal, or do you care about how much we answer in our lifestyle, so to speak? Or
when it comes down to it, this may even just be a rhetorical question that you take and think about as personally as you possibly can be with yourself.
sure, yeah,
And if you want to share anything with the group, that's fine, but it doesn't need to be personal.
That sounds like a first. Are you paying attention, Jacob? I don't think we've had a critical thinking question kind of extend beyond the bounds of the meeting time before.
It certainly feels rhetorical to me.
So, congratulations, Brandon. No, I think that's pretty neat.
Well, all right. I guess I can just answer if you want. I can answer.
No, you
No,
can
you don't
answer.
have to. We're just kind of like we're transitioning.
I'm absorbing.
Like
I'm absorbing what just happened, and I'm just trying to understand a little more of your question. So it's interesting for you to sort of tack on like a tag or an explanatory note of like, it's maybe you think of it as like a self-help sense or personal sense or even an
sure.
unanswerable sense. So that's fine.
Cool. All right.
I can somewhat answer the question with some statements that I'll say are informed by my personal life, but I'm not going to be talking about my personal life. Is your time useful to you? A couple of statements about that. Your time is not necessarily useful to you. Your time has the potential to be useful to you. And furthermore, a statement that connects to your monologue, something I wrote down. The units or the unit total of time is limited to man. But the unit potential of time is not limited to man.
I like that.
And your time is only useful when you keep eternity in mind, but your focus on now. That series of statements that are informed by my personal life, but are not about my personal life.
No, I like that. That was a good answer.
Stephen, could you expand on that a little bit? Go back to that statement you just made. The unit or the units of time of men are limited, or what did you say?
Yeah, I'll restate it. The time available to a man is limited in unit, but unlimited in potential.
Okay.
Kind of this duality, the finite nature of the time available to a man, and yet the infinite potential of that time. Potential, in this case, referring to what may be done with that time. That's where infinity comes in.
Stephen understands.
I don't know about that.
Stephen understands the teaching.
Nice job, Stephen.
Thumbs up.
Would that make him the farmer?
Learned, right?
The learned one, right?
Right. Okay. Let me just summarize this real quickly. The time available to a man by unit is finite. But by potential unit is infinite, or how did you want to say that?
Unit potential.
But by unit potential.
No unit.
Oh, but by potential.
In the antithesis statement.
You can't give a unit to the potential because it's beyond the bounds of units.
Whoa!
Oh,
There goes middle school physics. Just
Yep.
potential energy or something? Nah. Just kinetic. Just kinetic, boys. That's okay.
Okay, this is why I need to shut up now. Okay, never mind.
Do you remember that, Jacob? The whole thing about a ball higher on the wall? Never mind. It's okay. Remember that? You remember that part, Jacob, about the measuring the... Never mind. Stable, unstable, and metastable? Do you remember that? No? Okay. It's okay.
Oh, God is 7.
Oh yeah, don't forget about that one.
I really just wanted to say that again because I loved it so much.
I'm sorry.
God is 7. Okay.
7. I love that. I'm not being facetious with that. It's that's just a fun thing to say. You got it all wrong. It's not a what was it? It's not a 42. It's not the answer.
7 is the
But
answer.
42 is a multiple of 7.
Interesting. Maybe.
It's 7 less than the square of 7.
It's 6 sevens.
So it's an incomplete 7?
6 gods? What? I mean, what are we talking about?
I don't know. You're the one who decided to pull in,
No, that was me.
atoms.
I randomly threw something out there that probably didn't make any sense. So
Okay,
No.
I'll throw one more random thing out there, and then I'll stop throwing random things. So I thought that the relationship between the preacher and the prince was fascinating when I started thinking about what the potential relationship between Aristotle and Alexander the Great is.
ooh,
Because Aristotle was the teacher to Alexander the Great, who then went on to conquer the world and do things no one could imagine. And it's somewhat speculated that Aristotle was probably not completely proud of everything that Alexander went on to do. So I thought that was super cool to consider.
I also kind of thought about the relationship between whoever the teacher of Solomon might have been. Since Solomon did not stay in the path in his later life. But yeah, I hadn't thought about Alexander the Great. I like that. Word from our sponsors. Smirnoff vodka.
Ooh.
The thing you drink when there is nothing else left to drink.
I thought you were drinking water.
No wonder he was coughing.
No wonder you take a sip of water and then cough more.
I thought you were tearing up in the middle of the monologue, too. I was like, boy, this guy's just really... This is tearing his insides. It was actually more like burning his throat, but, you know.
Same difference.
Oh, well. Same difference, right?
Yeah.
Oh, well.
So much truth revealed.
Indeed.
Would be funny if everybody picked up a different sponsor from the objects at hand. I have Seiko watches for the proper division of time.
Oh.
Watch out for Navitas, natural cacao nib provider. Available in not very many local supermarkets, but in a few.
But it's a superfood.
Very super food, organic.
Jacob,
Okay,
you've been
Jacob.
decidedly
Shop
silent.
on Amazon for the Genius brand. High quality supplements of many kinds. For a limited time, buy one bottle, get one free.
The good indwelling genius. Oh, man.
Oh, okay.
Now that we've had our word from our sponsors.
Stephen, did you finish your remarks, or were you going to add in as a critical thinking question yourself?
Well, I can add it in my critical thinking question, but I was going to make sure anyone else wanted to answer Brandon's question.
Oh, Brandon's question? Well, I will give Jacob some more time if he wants to think or something like that. I think I'm going to come up with a pretty simple, straightforward answer, and it's yes to Brandon's critical thinking question. Just try to keep it short, succinct. But I think it's accurate. Is my time useful to me? Yes. Yes, it is right now. And I don't know. I think that's sufficient. If that needs to be expounded upon later, then I can do that. But that's that's what came to me. Sure, I could sit here and imagine all the things that I can do or should do with my time, or we can put out my schedule and have it reviewed from an ethical sense or something like that. But I thought just to keep it short and say, I think there can be a one-word answer to your question. For me, it's yes.
Good. Please share with me all of your secrets.
And this is a book club meeting, not a shrink session, okay? Or at least that's how it was billed. At this point, I'm starting to be happy that, my invitees didn't come. Talk about freaking them out and they wouldn't come back.
Sponsors. Yeah. I don't know. Jacob, you want to say anything about Brenda's question?
I think I'll leave it.
Unanswered. Got it. I don't have to go first, but I do have a critical thought question.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so I will riff off of Brandon's focus on time. Time is obviously a limited resource for humanity. It's been considered the most valuable resource because it is the most scarce to humanity. And I would like for us to spend a little bit of time thinking about time as a resource, and say the more time that is devoted to a thing is the more resources that are devoted to a thing. So if you consider something as simple as an idea can be wealthy or poor. If you and we're going to define the wealth and the poor, that the wealth of an idea as the amount of time that's devoted to it. So we can have ideas that are incredibly poor.
You just cut out, Steven. I don't know if you cut out for anybody else. Can you go back?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you cut out for me too.
You were somewhere at the point of an idea is poor, I think.
An idea can be poor or rich, depending on the amount of time that is devoted to that idea.
Mm-hmm.
So some ideas, a person will come up with it and then perhaps ignore it. And at that point, it is the poorest of all ideas. It has the minimum amount of time attributed to it. However, a person might come up with an idea and then devote a good deal of their own time to it. So the value of that idea is grown because of the great amount of time that person has put into it. But the value of time of an idea can be increased even more when that idea is given to others, put into some form, like written down or spoken or expressed, so that others can get at it themselves. Then other people can start adding time to the idea. And if you look at the ideas, for instance, of Aristotle, you would see what are perhaps the wealthiest ideas in the history of man because of the incredible amount of time that has been devoted to them. So my critical thought question is, if you consider time devoted to an idea, does that give you a good idea of how much an idea is worth?
Okay, repeat the question, please, again. Exactly as you said.
Exactly, it might change.
Okay.
Does the amount of time devoted to an idea give you a good representation of the worth of that idea?
Accurate measurement thereof, I think,
Accurate
is better.
measurement of the worth of that idea.
Amount of time dedicated to an idea.
Give you an accurate measurement of the worth of that idea.
You could say intrinsic worth, or maybe that's putting words in your mouth, because you
No,
could
I
actually
wouldn't-
specify
I wouldn't
worth a couple of different ways.
True.
I wouldn't even know if I would necessarily insert that word intrinsic, Jacob, just because my corollary to Stephen's idea of sharing ideas is that as soon as an idea is beyond the original creator or the original thinker, the idea will evolve. So it's not necessarily intrinsic because it's going to start to evolve and it could snowball and it could pick up things or change meanings or something like that. So I would personally say, I don't know if intrinsic fits, but it might. And what was the tail end of the sentence? An accurate, give you, spent on an idea, give you an accurate, what was the word, Stephen? The time spent on an idea will give you an accurate estimate of its worth?
Sure, that's good.
Okay. Well, the reason I'm specifically kind of picking on this and trying to get the wording right, estimate of its worth, is because it seems like you've just kind of set up a tautology.
What's that?
It's, just a minute, let me finish this. A tautology, let me go ahead and just get this off the dictionary, because it's one of those things that I recognize, but it's hard for me to exactly. Okay, tautology, simply said here in the dictionary, is the saying of the same thing twice in different words, generally considered to be a fault of style. A phrase or expression, number 2, a phrase or expression in which the same thing is said twice in different words. Or this one, they specifically have logic. Number 3, logic, a statement that is true by necessity or by virtue of its logical form. And so what I'm saying here is that Stephen seems like he was just proposing to create a value system of ideas to value, to ascribe values to these ideas because of the time spent on the ideas. And now he wants to ask us, is the time spent on the ideas a value of the idea? So it's just a little too circular. You see what I'm saying, Stephen?
Yeah, I guess I do. Would it be less of a tautology, or however you say that, if we edited the question to say, is this time value system a good value system?
Okay, yeah, that's simplified. The thing that I wrote down from your original statement was basically, are you using time, specifically like time spent? Oh, Jacob stepped away.
He has his headphones with him. He heard.
Okay. Basically, to me, it sounded like you're saying, are you using time spent on an idea as the ultimate denominator of its value? That was the question of what your system is. Because you proposed a value system, right? And your value system is, the time cumulatively spent by potentially multiple people on an idea is going to be the way to mark high value or low value. And you described low value as poor. I forgot what you described high value as. Rich? Or
rich and poor.
Okay.
Resource,
something like that.
Or not resource, yeah.
Okay, because time is the ultimate resource. So, I think that's an interesting, it's a good follow-up. If time is the ultimate resource, as like the first clause. The second clause is we have all these ideas laying around. The third clause would be like, if time is the most expensive resource, can we say that the value of these ideas can go up and go down depending on the time spent on them, right?
Sure. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay, so it's a good question. It's a good question. I'm going to think on it here just a little bit.
Well, Jonathan thinks I can give a response if that's okay with the group.
Yeah, go ahead.
We've talked a lot about worldwide ideas and how somebody considers, how the whole world may consider an idea, and then that idea is assigned a value based upon the amount of time spent upon it by the collective human race. I'm not going to discuss that. I'm going to discuss you can discover what is most valuable to an individual by the amount of time spent in pursuit, thought, and enjoyment of any particular thing. And you can thereby derive what they love most. Time is the money of the gods. You could think of it that way if you want to use a stupid.
Time is the money of men, I'd say.
All right. Whatever overblown metaphor you want to use. The most true money of men. So time is the true money of men. I actually really like that, Jonathan. So whatever men spend their time dollars on the most is that which they love the most. So in that way, at least on an individual scale, it would seem to follow that time as a delineator of value makes sense. I don't really know if I can say that holds true on a worldwide humanity sense.
Well, I'll jump in as well then. I do think it's a good question. I think that each of the answers are going to be from a different perspective. Mine is to say that there is a heavenly perspective of value, and we as humans seek to know what that measurement may be for given uses of time. Thereby, one option for the measurement of such is exactly what you proposed, Stephen, to accumulate to sum the hours that men have put into individual ideas. The way that I have understood the question is to say that we should see, if the answer is yes, then we should see strong correlation between the ideas which humans have given the most time and the ideas which have been heavenly deemed the best. My answer is indeed no. For humans, desires and values are not those of God. Humans are not seeking truth in this heavenly sense.
Hashtag total depravity.
And yet, what if one countered that by saying it takes a good deal of time to read a book, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So if we looked at all the books that have ever existed, and we considered what books people have read the most throughout all of human history, and then we see that the Bible has been read most of all books in human history, and that suggests that it's the most valuable book, which would also be true from a heavenly perspective, then how do you explain that, for instance?
I explain it as you've taken a more positive perspective to my negative. I would value the heavenly truth of the Bible more adequately measured against all the philosophies of the world. And indeed, if you measure the similar philosophies, if you were to rank them into groups, as is commonly done in science, the effort that is put into any one of those individual groups may very well outweigh the time that is put into study of the Bible. Theology and the other biblical sciences are considered in an individual rank along with all the other philosophies in terms of science. Well, more specifically, the scientific categorization of philosophies. So I would say yes, but your measurement system on that is maybe where I would defend my position from.
Right.
Going with, if you're finished with that, Jacob,
Yes.
going from what he just says, which I think is a very accurate response, a sort of micro example. Micro is not necessary, but an example of that would be, of course, the Church of Latter-day Saints, which claim to have been founded by a man who had special revelations from God because of different angels, and that he respected God, and that he respected God even more than most of the people around him who were in these different denominations of churches, etc., etc. And yet, after Joseph Smith founded this movement of people, they now have, what, 3 additional books beyond the Bible? And they have spent, in general, en masse, the majority of their time working on expounding, reading, teaching, etc. There are 3 additional books beyond the Bible. Correct? So we have the Book of Mormon, Pearl of Great Price, and Doctrines and Covenants, and whatnot. Now, they would probably respond something like, no, we still believe in the foundational, fundamental importance of the Bible, and we use it to start to build our belief systems, etc., etc. And yet they will go and value as God-given truth a book based on a translation of magic Egyptian tablets which now no longer exist. Right. So that's just one example for your question, Stephen. And I would agree with Jacob in that particular instance. In terms of when you first put out your critical thinking question, the first thing actually that came into my mind was man hours, which is a phrase that Jacob almost used. And you are sort of trying to calculate and look at almost man hours used on an idea, man hours spent on this and whatnot. And I don't know why, I don't remember where, but I ran into man hours in a section that I was reading this last week where someone was doing the, it was in a movie I saw. They were talking about, it was a movie about gold prospecting, actually. And specifically gold prospecting and mining. And they were talking about why it's the most, well, the explanation given in the movie was, why this is the most valuable metal in this case is that there are so many people spending so much time, spending so many man hours that calculate and that you decide about how many of those men on any given mountain are going to find the gold, et cetera, et cetera. And when you sum all of that and look at the total, then the gold is very, very valuable because so many people want it. And so many people will do something to go look for it. So that's the first thing that I thought of with your question is, does the amount of time spent on an idea give you an accurate estimate of its worth? I have to sort of agree with Jacob again. I have to agree with him again because all you're looking at with that question is basically like a head count. It's a statistical thing. It's trying to do a calculation, but again, it's from a human perspective. And this is why I was trying to ask you about your tautology of saying, I'm going to build this value system, and now does this value system give me good measurements? It's too circular in this particular case because we see many ideas that get a lot of airplay, they get a lot of teaching, they get time expounded on them, and yet they're ultimately what I would call not good. And so I have to agree with Jacob that the value system needs to be, I would say, almost like pierced, like the human value system has kind of like some kind of dome or some kind of object, and it needs to be pierced by something coming in from heaven and which is as talked about in some of these works that we're reading now, like the summum bonum idea, the thing that comes out from God, the highest good, and all those kind of things. Now, different people disagree with what that is, but if you want to just do a statistical sort of count about how valuable is this idea, and can we try to use it, can we try to determine that by counting up and calculating and doing this and this, it's not going to bring you to an ethical truth. It'll bring you just to a statistic or to a number answer, basically.
Mhm.
But it's not going to bring you to anything like morality, good or evil, something like that.
No. Perhaps we've mistakenly left the term value undefined. It seems that there's value in an ultimate sense, intrinsic value, what was referred to earlier, and there's value in a useful sense.
Extrinsic.
Yeah, and maybe that, I think that might be something that we need to expound upon a bit further. I can if you want, but I prefer not.
You just don't want to talk anymore, do you?
Yeah.
Um, it's funny because people would argue that it is. So interesting. I love these answers. Extrinsic value. Well, I think that the Positive Perspectives Book Club's existence and its methodology kind of reveals that we believe the amount of time spent on an idea is a good representation of its value, because we only spend time looking at ideas that have a very large amount of time delineating their value. So like, I think this is fundamental to our book club. Like we're acting like we believe this, which is interesting to me. I think that's all I'll say about the extrinsic value idea. If I was faced with this idea, or if I was faced with this question, this critical thought question, I would have come at it from a very different angle. I would have talked about how there's this somewhat controversial doctrine in Scripture that time has a beginning, but does it have an end? Some people say yes, there will be an end of time, the end of days. Other people say no, time is actually going to extend forward to infinity. It's going to extend forward to eternity. So its time is not boundless. It has a beginning, but it does not have an end. That is one view, that is one doctrine of the Bible. And if it is true that time does not have an end, then that means that we as people will always exist within time, and that eventually the amount of time spent on an idea, any idea that is truly of value, will reach infinity, because we will extend forward into infinity with time. So only the ideas that have eternal value would be seen as valuable using the resource
Eternal yardstick.
time. Yeah. So all of the other ideas would fall into nothingness because of how much less time would have been devoted to them. That's how I would have gone about trying to answer that question. I don't know if that's a useful answer to the question, but it does beat the question.
It beats the question. I guess I'll put on one more little statement, which is, it's kind of like a non-answer, but I still think it's important to say, and then that's kind of be that, unless I can, maybe expound on it or something like that. But the other thing I was going to say to that, I mean, all of this is flowing kind of cloudily. We have quite a few terms here in Stephen's question that we haven't strictly defined. But the first thing I thought of actually was, Stephen's trying to say, what about time spent on this idea versus time spent on another idea and everything like that? And what I wanted to say was, well, how do you want to classify these ideas? And what about repetition of idea, just in a different sort of form? What about something like that? Okay, now generalizing or being able to kind of stratify or classify the way that Jacob is talking about is a human tool. But I remember when I was in high school and I was looking at this history book that I was working with, and I knew about Nazism, and I knew about fascism in Europe, and then I knew a little bit about communism and everything. And the title of the chapter that we were looking at for talking about this history of this part of the world during this time was talking about totalitarianism. Now, totalitarianism is a system that is, or it's an idea that's going to be kind of like higher or superior to something more specific like fascism or communism or whatever you want to say. But totalitarianism is not a bad term to try to describe lots of these different kinds of, in this particular way, political things. And so I was wondering, when you asked this question of, well, how many different discrete ideas are there? And is there an infinite number of discrete ideas? Or is there a finite number of discrete ideas? Because many ideas that people have end up converging. Right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what I was thinking. And I was thinking that this is a little bit more likely, specifically because of basically the idea of words in general.
How interesting. Yes.
Now you think about, there's different kinds of words and different kinds of nouns specifically. I'm thinking about nouns, and I was thinking about something that I was reading about, actually it was a philosophical thing at another point. But the idea was that we give names to things based on how they are compared to other things, and if they're similar or not. And so this kind of thing is called a chair, and this kind of thing is called a cup. And we can extend that out to immaterial things like emotions, values, virtues, things like this. And so one of the things, this was actually the last thing in the video that you sent out, Stephen, with the man who was doing the summary on Aristotle. His specific word, he was talking about magnanimity. I don't know if you remember that or not. I was just looking at that video this afternoon, so that's why it's in my mind. But the thing I thought about magnanimity is that magnanimity is this immaterial thing And yet, different people, many different people, can manifest it in many different ways depending on the situation. And so, magnanimity is kind of an idea of being generous. In English is how I was looking at the definition here. I mean, really, the Latin is magnus meaning big and animus meaning like soul or spirit. It's like a large soul or something like that. And so when I want to, like, say, encourage Brandon, it's less effective for me to say something to Brandon like, Brandon, magnanimity. Or Brandon, be magnanimous. But it can be more effective for me to take whatever the concept of magnanimity is and then manifest it more specifically to him. So I might be kind to him, I might be listening to him, I might not interrupt him during his time, whatever it is, right? And so I suppose because, in a way, I think about it this way, language itself is finite. I mean, yes, you can always create new words, but do you always create new objects to go with those words? Not really. In that same way that it's limited, I think that ideas are also limited, and that there is a finite number of discrete ideas. And that's kind of the playing field. And so, yeah, we can say that, hey, yeah, this idea seems to get a lot of airtime, or this idea is lesser, or something like that. But ultimately, you may be kind of counting the wrong thing, because you're dividing things which are actually basically the same. They have the same, they exist as the same thing. Okay, so anyhow, that's kind of abstract and whatnot. But it's another thing to...
much.
That's Aquinas.
I love that so much.
That was very good.
Like logos?
Because you decrease resolution each step down until it's fathomable. So Platonic. It's all like 100% Platonic reasoning. And there's even new research. There's a lot of modern research in neuroscience and linguistics, kind of interdisciplinary research, showing how the language you speak, or just speaking language, controls the thoughts, the kinds of thoughts and the way you think at the level of your brain, your neurosynapses, which kind of gives a biological reason that we would perceive the divided line to be true. It's like it's a byproduct of language in a way. It's also very interesting. However, it also kind of touches with Aristotle and Aquinas, because Aquinas obviously used Aristotle's initial premises and methods and then extended it onward to the point where he was supporting or proving or clarifying biblical truths, which is amazing to even consider, but it furthermore supports the idea of there being an ideal form and the idea of the good, and Aristotle accessing that at a very low level, and then Aquinas bringing it up to a higher level, because of his using the Bible and the influence of the Holy Spirit, he's able to bring it up to that higher level of truth. But all of that, I feel like you did finally make the argument of time irrelevant with that last bit, Jonathan.
With talking about different ideas that are really the same?
Well, pointing out the finite number of ideas,
Oh, yeah.
and then talking about how various ideas are the same, and then talking about how those ideas, the conceptualization or description of those ideas is limited by language, which brings us back to the ideal form kind of thought, which in this case means that Aristotle must have stumbled upon something like a mathematical model or an ideal form, and then Aquinas was able to take it up to the next level on the divided line of truth. I don't know, I feel like that all connects really well in my brain, and I don't know while I'm communicating the connection I see, but I think that's all wonderful discussion.
Well, I have a critical thinking question. If we're ready to move on.
Sure, go ahead, Jacob.
How can you? Okay, so some preface. Stephen, actually, I almost didn't ask this question because Stephen's was so similar in some ways, but with a slight modification, I think this is still valid. How can you practically value the uses, the activities, the uses of time? We spend our time doing things. How can we measure the usefulness of these things?
Can you ask it one more time with fewer words? Sorry. Just helps me understand.
How can we know that what we're using our time for is useful? Now, this question actually stemmed from what I consider to be a blank point in the narrative, in the monologue.
There was a gap for what he was saying. Is that what you're saying?
As far as thoughts are concerned, I think so.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
In the section called "On Use the Common," we talk about the serf and him using time. And from my perspective, the preacher judges him for this later addressed moderation, but fails to provide an alternative.
Interesting.
Could you go through that section a little bit, Jacob, just to give some context?
Yeah.
Just pull out any of the important bits that you think go with your question.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have, do you ever allow your fields to lie dormant beyond the natural fallow period? Well, what is the natural fallow period? What is dormancy? There was something a bit even more on point. He spent all of his days to satisfy the bare requirements of hearth and home, dutifully follow the instructions of his superiors, etc. Well, that's something. He could have been a bum on the street and begged.
Oh, this is the merchant in the faraway city, right?
This is the serf.
This serf.
And he was called as the... he wasn't a merchant. He was called the serf. That's right.
There was another thing. Maybe it was later.
Oh, dear.
In the same chapter. It said something like him being sent out. I can search. When he might have embarked upon some great mission to change the very nature of his city, he passed over those thoughts and returned to the task at hand. Never to be bother over much. Well, hopefully that provides some context, Jonathan.
Well, that's a lot to think about in one question. Jonathan, do you have anything to say immediately?
No, I'm just going to think for a moment.
Okay. This was not stated in the section regarding the serf, but I think perhaps one of the things that might speak to what I meant is every person can do an action and it be a good action, but it intrinsically be a bad action because of the ends for which the action was done. So the serf goes home after work and reads a philosophical tome, and he just kind of does this to pass the time. The vanity of existence, just watching the hours go away. The prince sets ends, but those ends are on the other end of the extreme, namely his own worship, people worshiping him, people falling under his empire and his dominance. The one has ends, but in at least the framework of this treatise, they aren't really made entirely clear. There's just some sort of great, powerful creating energy evident in the one's abilities. So I think the best answer I could give to your question, and I definitely see the gap, and I did not necessarily do the best of jobs in answering that, is that the ends tell you what course of time's use is most valuable, and you can definitely spend time on the same things. But if the ends of that spending of time are not good, then in that case, the ends do not necessarily justify the means, I guess. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I could say to make that clearer, because I definitely see the gap. Aristotle talks about, this idea of on one side there is righteous anger, if you want to call that being good, and in the middle, or no, uncontrolled anger on one side. In the middle is righteous anger, and on the other side is being passive, right? I almost feel like that entire framework is flawed. How can you analyze something on a spectrum? It seems to me that there are things that are clearly right and clearly wrong. It doesn't seem possible to analyze things on a spectrum of what's sort of good and sort of bad. And that's the way the serf analyze things, is on a spectrum. The color spectrum. On one side there's one color, on the other is another, and all actions being held equal allows them to be analyzed on this spectrum, but all actions aren't equal. I don't know, that's a poor analysis. I think I'll just stick with the thing I said about ends.
I don't think it's a particularly poor analysis, Brandon, but I'm going to go there in a moment, but not per se with this question. It's going to be more my critical thinking question. So thanks for the intro.
Do you want to restate the question again?
Yeah, could you give that one more time, Jacob?
How do we measure what is good? Well, I guess a restatement might be more apt.
I can tell you what I wrote down.
We use
I
our
gave-
time for different things. How can we tell if what we're doing with our time is useful? And initially, I believe I used the word practically. Maybe that will help evoke a less philosophical answer.
Or taking into account what Aristotle says about ethics and what Brandon just said about you can know something's value by the means, or not by the ends that are achieved. Then if your time is spent doing something which will help you achieve the end of happiness, then you know it was well spent. That seems to be what Aristotle suggests. True happiness. Since that is that for the sake of which that Aristotle puts forward. And I'm trying to decide if Aquinas would agree with that. He might. Aquinas might agree with that as well. That in the end, happiness is the goal, but he might say that happiness would be achieved when you're living in accordance with the will of God. But he could just as honestly say everything you spend time on, if it's leading you towards achieving the end of happiness, is good. It's good to spend time on. I think they might both agree with that, but I don't know for sure. I think I'd have to read everything Aquinas wrote in order to give a certain answer about what he would think for that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that answer is very satisfactory to me. The critical thinking questions here are so to be something that we can take and consider and basically learn from based on our own critical thinking of the concept. If I wanted to audit my past week and the uses of my time in some discrete, range of actions, I'd like a method that provided me with a answer of yes, this was a good use, or no, this was not. And while perhaps, I could maybe try and say, oh, does this make me ultimately happy? I don't think I could answer that affirmatively or negatively. I think that that's actually escaping the heart of my question entirely, because I can't say, did that make me ultimately happy, truthfully happy, or didn't it? Like, I can't use that as a measurement tool or a metric.
In that case, allow me at least to make another attempt at answer. I was avoiding this answer because it seemed too simple, but I also think this is the more true answer. When it comes down to it, you can rank your actions by, okay, this action achieved this action achieved this. I'll use an example. The value of reading a book might be more valuable than playing video games, depending upon where it was in the week. If you got home from work around 3:30 p.m. and had a lot of time and you spent the whole rest of the night playing video games, I would say, what did you achieve by that action? And if you scratch your head and say, well, I don't know if I achieved anything besides rest, and that would be an answer that would really gloss over it, because a more true answer would probably be, I gained some sort of pleasure from playing video games. Now, let's say instead of doing that, you had read and spent time with your wife and worked towards some life goal. That seems to me to be a more practical measurement, because one of those actions achieves something, one of them doesn't really seem to achieve anything at all. But that's funny, because at the same time, it's not that there's no value in playing video games, because if you, at the end of your week on your day of rest, played video games because you were exhausted from a long week of labor, there's great value in that action, because the end of that action is preparing yourself for the next week of labor through rest. So maybe a better way of saying what I said earlier would be, is the end at which your action is pointing something that immediately takes effect in your life? I don't know. Playing video games constantly seems to allow those fields of time to lie dormant, to lie fallow beyond the natural fallow period, beyond what is customary. It's customary for man to rest at least one day. But if activities of rest are at a point where they are happening 6 days out of 7, then that activity of rest is no longer serving its purpose. It's now an activity of empty pleasure. It's not an activity of manly labor. So yeah, that's probably going to give me the idea of how to further finish this treatise that you just asked. So thank you.
It seems like in order to determine the value of the time that you spent doing something, especially in a kind of self-audit this past week, from that kind of a perspective, it seems like you would have to have a reference of what valuable time looks like in order to compare to and maybe multiple references, many references of what valuable time looks like within certain contexts, so that you can compare it to what you actually did with your time. In which case you could theoretically use something like Nicomachean ethics or Summa Theologica, or the Bible. You could use it as a reference and then compare, well, any one of those three as a reference, and compare the ideas and examples that are held therein to the situations that you found yourself in and what you chose to do with your time. And then decide, are they in line with this reference, or what I did with my time in line with what's taught in this reference, or was it not in line with what's taught in this reference? And then you just have to decide what you value and then make that your reference, or what is extrinsically valuable, not even just to you, but to some greater extent, and make that your reference. But it seems you must have a reference. A very dynamic and complete reference.
Which Jacob has. So to now begin to tread upon the danger of speaking too much, I will go ahead and continue. if Jacob has a dynamic reference, which he does, at that point, the system which he needs is just to simply say, in the 6 days out of 7, am I doing a restful action or a laborious action? If it's a restful action within those 6 days, it's probably not something that needs to happen until the 7th day of that action. And then within the laborious actions, there's subcategories. Laborious actions that serve my ends and laborious actions that serve higher ends. So then what we want is my ends and those higher ends to become one, such that now my ends are no longer my ends, but at the same time they are, except now they are the ends of this higher thing. Which is the closest I can get to a literal, practical method, if I had to come close to one.
But at minimum, you would have to allow sleep or a form of rest every day.
At the same time, that's laborious, though, because you're doing that so that you can labor more during those 6 days.
Okay, so then the 7th day, that rest would have to be different in that you're not resting just so that you can work more. You have to be resting for a different reason. So it's a different kind of rest. Okay.
I'm just sort of outlining and diagramming here. And what I've come up with, I think, Jacob, the simple answer, the one that I'm satisfied with, is just 2 things, 2 words. Pursue wisdom. That's all. It's a very good question. I'm very sympathetic to the question. I think I understand for some reasons why you would ask the question. I think I may understand or can sympathize in some of the circumstances that make you ask the question. How can you tell practically if what you spend your time on is useful? It's a very, very good question. And it's like almost, we could set this question like repeating almost every time we have a book club meeting, really. But what I see is you're saying, okay, I want to simplify my system. I have an audit, per se, of my past time, let's say it's a week. And I'd like to simplify it almost down to going from answers that sit on a spectrum, as Brandon has used the word, a spectrum almost of all real numbers, down to a very simple set of binary. Yes, no, good, not good, good, ungood, up, down. And I can definitely sympathize with that kind of interest in simplifying things down. I don't know if it's possible for everything. I'm going to say probably not everything, but yeah, in a lot of ways, definitely with a lot of voluntary actions, it's not a bad idea per se. But the actual thing here, I'll make a comparison and contrast, and maybe this will help you out a little bit. The first thing I thought of with this question, and kind of with, I guess, Stephen, while he was answering and he's given like 2 different or 3 different sets of answers, 3 different sessions or something, kind of response. What I was thinking of, actually, I was thinking about doing a compare and contrast between Aristotle, actually, and Professor Jordan B. Peterson, of all people. And the reason I thought of this is because of Stephen saying, well, I guess you would kind of need an aim? And I was like, yes, of course. That's the first thing I thought of. You have to have an aim for your actions. And so the first thing that I think of is the response to your question is kind of the next question is, what is the aim of your actions? And again, that video that Stephen found, I haven't heard anybody reference it necessarily, that he sent us. That was kind of a summation of Nicomachean ethics. But it was really good, and I really respected that guy a lot. And that's why I would actually say let's not use the word happiness, because if you noticed, that guy was interested in using the Greek term that Aristotle used. And so the term is actually eudaimonia.
Yeah.
Eudaimonia, which I think is a better word. And so seemingly Aristotle's idea of what's your aim is aim for eudaimonia, which is this good soulness or a completion idea. The comparison is not perfect, but I think about a little bit what I've heard Jordan B. Peterson give as his definition of truth. And if I remember correctly, his definition of truth runs something along the lines of truth is anything that increases the likelihood or has the benefit of survival in sort of a Darwinian kind of sense. And I think you should be able to see really immediately that these two aims, and Peterson is not necessarily saying this is an aim, but this is his definition of truth. I find that definition of truth woefully inadequate. It's just, it's really inadequate. It's not enough. But if, say, Peterson was to say, for example, spend your life in the pursuit of truth, and you're going to use the Peterson definition of truth, that's what you would be doing. Ultimately, you're going for that benefit of survival. Aristotle's saying what you should do, and actually what everybody is doing, is eudaimonia. Aristotle doesn't necessarily speak to survival. A quick, obvious example for why Peterson's definition of truth is inadequate is because a lie can be obviously self-serving enough to increase your survival. And also, beyond just mere survival, Peterson talks about a sort of biological hierarchy, a sociological, not even sociological, but more of a social, I need to simplify the words out here, social, biological hierarchy. And he almost puts it as an idea to ascend the hierarchy. And so one of the examples that I heard someone put out, immediately a counterexample of that was when Peterson was talking about Brett Kavanaugh last October, and whether Kavanaugh was going to be confirmed to the U.S. Supreme Court or not. And someone said, look, according to Peterson's definition of truth, Kavanaugh's own interest and best plan is to lie so that he can ascend his hierarchy and go up into a higher court, basically the highest court. If you assume that Kavanaugh actually was guilty and did the things that they accused him of. Okay, so that's Peterson's inadequacy there. And maybe he's going to address that sometime, I don't know. But I find Aristotle a lot more convincing. In terms of that eudaimonia. Now, I guess I'll go ahead and just put in this last bit, and hopefully it's going to bring it all the way back around to pursue wisdom. But again, I agree with you, and I'm sympathetic to your point about the serf in Brandon's monologue. And this man that was sort of described as doing things, but it was an improper, incomplete use of time. That's sort of the implication or the exact thing that Brandon was saying with the mouths of these characters. And you kind of wanted to know why. Why was that necessarily the right way? And I agree with that. I see what you're saying. There's a lack of information. And Brandon either specifically or whatnot didn't put that in there. So we don't know all about this serf's life and whatnot. But as you obviously rightly said, the guy could have been a bum in the street instead of supporting a family, working a consistent job, etc. So my question is, we have incomplete information about the serf, but are the expectations about him and for him and what he wants with his life, and specifically what he does with his lifestyle in time and how he spends time, is it accurate or is it just wildly off? Okay, because from the point of view of the character in Brandon's monologue, the expectation was this guy didn't quite do everything he could have, or this guy didn't spend everything appropriately, all the time appropriately. And as you pointed out, it's like, well, wait a minute, what is this expectation? First of all, we don't know this serf, we don't meet him, we don't speak to him, and yet we want to sit here in judgment about him and his lifestyle and in his doing or not doing with time. Why? And so the follow-up question for me is, okay, so are these expectations accurate or wildly off? How do you discern what the potential of a person is? And as a second question to that, do all people have identical potentials? And I mean, this is in my mind just because a lot of the things I've been reading over the last couple of weeks, actually different things online and people writing about different things. But even Brandon touched on this with his answer of comparing and contrasting the serf to the prince. Okay. Now, clearly, the serf and the prince live in different parts of the hierarchy. If you want to call it a hierarchy, and I would say that's fine, they live in different points. And it doesn't even seem that these two characters have the same background. This prince has, lots of education, etc., lots of preparation. He's obviously in a higher station. He has bigger expectation. I'm not trying to riff on this, but it's some kind of occupation. Anyway, but the expectation on the prince is like this, and the expectation on the serf is like this, and you called attention to, like, wait a minute, what is this imbalance? And so just my thought is, basically it kind of goes to that part actually in the U.S. Constitution, right there in the preamble where we say all men are created equal. And my question is, well, is that necessarily true? How do the authors mean to say that? And is that exactly right? Are all people created equal? Do all people have, say, identical potentials?
So you've kind of been working through this thought, but we acknowledged it earlier. Stephen said and we seem to accept it, that the potential value of time is unlimited.
Yeah, but we're
individuals, not just time.
Okay, so the potential
an individual's
for time,
use of time is, you can reform it like that, but yes. So,
sure.
How do you work around that?
My question is, for example, are all abilities equally distributed? Obviously not.
Does it matter?
Yes, it does.
Right. Here's all I can say to that. The farmer understood in the monologue that a life is judged by its fruit. Even if a person's actions are not necessarily good or bad, if their life bears no fruit, whatever that general undefined term that I have just used means to you, if their life bears no fruit, thus they receive their title. And so he received the title, the serf. You will know them by their fruit. You will know them by their fruit. Some will bear 20-fold, 50-fold, 100-fold. Some will bear nothing at all. And
that is helpful, Brandon. Follow me here just for 1 second. If what we said about time's potential being unlimited is true, then there must be an absolute value hierarchy where everyone is on the level playing field. The only hierarchy that I know that's like that is one in which the poor will be rich, the weak will be strong.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I would see what your point is with that. So that would be what? A hierarchy of a non-physical, a hierarchy of a spiritual dimension, the hierarchy of the kingdom of heaven as it's
Out of
prophesied
necessity. Out of necessity. It must be
about. It's going to
spiritual.
be that. So it's going to be spiritual. So, but are you spending, or if you audited your week all of last week, did you spend all of your time when you weren't sleeping and not playing video games? Did you spend all of your time on spiritual things? I would assume the answer is no. Not, at least not directly spiritual things. So I don't think that you're sitting there in the room where you are meditating all the time. Or
What even is a spiritual thing? A spiritual thing can be anything that serves a good end.
Well, it could also be an evil end. It doesn't have to be only a good end, but sure.
I mean, that's a very Catholic idea of spiritual things. Spiritual things don't necessarily have to be sitting in a monastery praying constantly. Spiritual things can be getting up in the morning and viewing the sunrise and saying a quick prayer.
Sure.
Spiritual thing.
I would agree with that. And, Stephen was the one trying to say that, well, it seems like that Aquinas is saying everybody needs to go to a monastery or something like that. Or maybe Stephen wasn't being completely genuine or facetious or whatnot. I would assume that Aquinas would say nothing of the kind, because not everybody is, adequate for monastery life. Okay, but we can say that there is what we might call a dignity, or there is a chance to pursue spiritual things in many different avenues. So maybe it's looking at the sunrise, maybe it's plowing with the ox, or maybe it's copying scriptures in the rectory. There's a chance to look for spiritual values in lots of places. How do you do that? When you have wisdom. That's the only answer that I can come up with in this short amount of time, is that you eventually have to get the wisdom. So that's what I would say is the answer to your question, Jacob, is pursue wisdom. That takes a lot of discipline itself. You're going to have to talk with, hopefully, people who are wiser than you. You're going to have to look at principles that wise people bring up and live by and whatnot like that. And ultimately, like I said, I don't know if you're ever going to get to the point where you can go binary yes or no on all of the actions, all the usefulness.
Yeah, and that's not really
that's not necessary.
It's
not necessary. No. I don't even think that you believe that's necessary.
That was tacked on. Yeah. Okay, yeah, I'll summarize. I didn't expect this question to go this way, but I asked, how can I say if what I'm doing is good, if what I'm doing is bad, if how I'm spending my time is useful? And I wanted something tangible, something useful that I could actually apply in a real life situation. So I said, let's evaluate the past week. And there were several thoughts around that. But what we came to realize is that we must measure. We must have basis for good in order to proceed with measuring such good.
Sure.
The question, although it was a bit maybe unclear, but we progressed to the state of, well, even in order to measure such, you would have to have a wisdom in order to perform this measurement. But the part that I found most enlightening here is when we started discussing, just at the end there, when I interjected with saying that this playing field, if we truly believe that time has an unlimited potential, this playing field must be non-physical, metaphysical, spiritual. I think that that's very telling, because what we're saying is we can set up a measurement hierarchy and we could probably do some measurements, but the only way that these measurements are going to be useful is if this hierarchy is one that is not limited by the bounds of time. I think it takes some critical thinking to get there, but that's my findings from this question.
I'd agree with that. I think I'd agree with that.
So the only way to decide the value of time spent is to analyze its spiritual worth, not its practical, physical worth.
Funny how we worked to that simple statement.
If there is no physical standard by which we can measure the worth of time. That's very interesting.
That has literally taken us the past hour, and that's awesome.
Well, we took the scenic route, I guess.
Meandered.
Does that make us time for another sponsor break, or do we just go on for the last critical thinking question?
Finish it out, my friend.
Okay. Again, lots of good discussion. My critical thinking question sort of was some of the objection that Brandon was just talking about. But basically it's this. My question is, must all descriptions of virtues, the virtues necessary for eudaimonia, must all descriptions of the virtues use a spectrum of too little and too much so that goodness is at the mean? And if you want me to expound on this question, the reason I ask it is because, kind of like Brandon, I'm dissatisfied with the idea of a spectrum. And the first one here, of course, is going back to this word of magnanimity or magnanimous. It's magnanimity. I always put an extra syllable in there. For example, the idea of magnanimous was contrasted with the idea of pusillanimous and also with the idea of conceit. Specifically by the man in this video. And so magnanimous was sort of described as the middle way, the good way of a big soul, is kind of what it, big spiritedness in Latin is what that means. Pusillanimous means little spirited, and then conceit would be the opposite extreme of too much, according to this particular way. But my question is, why do you always, or why should you analyze a virtue in between two vices or two lacking ideas? I mean, obviously, sometimes the idea of always contrasting a virtue against a vice or a good thing against a bad thing, sometimes that can get weak. But also, I think this structure of putting the virtue in between two different ones, because, for example, I don't think of conceit as being, I just don't even think that conceit has anything to do with those kind of ideas on that slider. If you're going to think about a spectrum and you want to put conceit on one side, I don't even think of conceit with that. So maybe I'm just missing something. But the question is, must all descriptions of virtues use a spectrum of too little and too much so that the good one, or that goodness, is at the mean?
I think what Aristotle was trying to do in that was delineate what is good by what it isn't. And it seemed easier to him to decide, okay, this is good because he was more readily able to describe what it wasn't. But what this seems to have resulted in the modern world is this idea of a spectrum, that man is a combination of both good and bad. That doesn't seem possible when you take it in line of man bearing fruit. A man doesn't plant a pear tree and worry whether there will be something that is halfway an apple being grown from that pear tree. He expects when he grows that pear tree that it will grow a pear, and that's just the way it is. Actions are the same way. Somebody does something, we're not expecting it to be halfway good, halfway bad. It is either good or it is bad. And I think Aristotle would agree with that, but when you're trying to describe what is a virtuous action from his perspective, with the knowledge he had to use the spectrum idea. And I think from his point of view, the spectrum was entirely necessary to delineate virtue. From our modern perspective, having the words of Christ, if you assume that those words are important and powerful and useful, then no, the spectrum doesn't have to hold any more weight. Because even the inner thoughts have now been analyzed. Anger in relation to murder has been analyzed. Desire in relation to adultery has been analyzed. And I think that ultimately was the thing that made man think, okay, there can be spectrums of right and wrong because of the fact that man can do something and think something else. But now we've taken it all the way to the roots of the tree, the thoughts, and seen, in the words of the teacher, that there are pears and there are apples. That's all there is to it. And that's found in the thoughts. So that's my answer.
Yeah, that's definitely, it brings up a good point. I was thinking about the Beatitudes, of course. I was thinking about, with regards to Stephen's question, I was thinking about Christ's call that you cannot serve both God and money. But where your treasure is, there your heart will be, as a sort of yardstick to determine that spent time, like Stephen was wondering about. So the Beatitudes definitely fit in there. The other thing I think about actually is another scripture in Judges, talking about the different fruits of different plants as a metaphor after Gideon dies. And it is consistent in the Bible that there's always the idea of the fruit comes from the plant of what it is, and there's no strange mutations or random freak occurrences of fruit on the wrong bush. That's not particularly brought up in scripture. Maybe you could make the interpretation that it might be somewhere, but it is consistent that it's always there, specifically with what Christ talks about. You're going to know them by their fruit. A bad tree doesn't produce good fruit. A good tree doesn't produce bad fruit. So, but I do understand what you mean with Aristotle trying to give a description on a spectrum so that you can sort of isolate a little bit.
I would like to point out that according to my understanding of Nicomachean ethics, he did use the idea of the mean to define the moral virtues. But then he didn't use the idea of the golden mean to describe the intellectual virtues, except for one, and I'm trying to look and find which one it was. But he sort of left it off when he started describing the intellectual virtues in the second half of Nicomachean ethics. And I was just thinking that that would directly answer your question, that no, you do not have to use the golden mean to describe a virtue. Now, if you mean a whole system of virtues, then Aristotle leaving out the mean on some of his virtues doesn't matter. But I just wanted to point out that Aristotle does not use the mean for all of his virtues to describe them or define them.
Sure. And it seems like it's a rhetorical device in this particular way. It's just kind of funny a little bit, because if you think about it, as if you want to take it like really absolutely and just really try to dial in and accept that idea of the spectrum of everything, what you're going to end up with is twice as much undesirable as desirable.
Because
Which
it's
is
for everyone, yeah.
Which is kind of a peculiar idea. I don't know if I can immediately jump in wholeheartedly with that idea. It's kind of like, I don't know. Is it really two for everyone? Or I don't know. So it is, I think it's a rhetorical flourish in a certain way.
I want to say, or my first reaction, my gut reaction was to say that biblically it just doesn't make sense to say that there are two wrong ways you could do a thing, but the one in the middle right way you could do a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't think of an example in the Bible that suggests that to be true, except the only example I can think of that might suggest that is the idea of the narrow path
Mm-hmm.
that few choose to walk on, where you can stray to the right or the left. That's the only thing in the Bible that comes to mind that could possibly support the idea that there's the negative extremes, but the good median. Outside of that, I think that the scripture is very clear about sin being opposite of God's will,
Holiness. Mm-hmm.
and holiness being in line with God's will, and then being on two different sides of the room, and they're not in the middle of two evils, they're just on two opposite ends.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not a spectrum of good and bad in between the two. There's a line with the bad over there and the good over there. But you could look at the analogy of this straight, narrow path that few choose to walk, that you can stray to the right or left. That's the only place I can see a biblical precedent.
Could be. Definitely could be. Jacob, do you want to put in a response?
I might. Unfortunately, I'm maybe a bit distracted, but there's there's a reduction of morality. Biblically speaking, hold on, I'll just bring up the verse. There's also a reduction of immorality to a certain set of things, but that's not as important. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. I did a framework once where I reduced all good actions to one of these three, and I take the verse to mean, in an eternal sense, faith, hope, and love are the virtues that continue to exist outside the context of time. Although that's very... There's a ton of assumptions in that. So what I would say is, if you wanted to set up some sort of system, or if you were trying to argue on the side of things that said, oh, these are means and evils go on, one side or another, you would have to take the three of these and say, well, Less faith leads to this. Too much faith leads to this. Less hope leads to this. Too much hope, and just do that for those three things. And then see if you can reduce our everyday evils down to one of those 6 evils that you've found. Now, like I said, I was a bit distracted, so maybe I can't express what those 6 evils are, whereas I otherwise might. But that's the framework that I would try to take in order to address your question.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good way to try to discover that. I think that I have no problem with accepting that Aristotle is using this as a rhetorical device, whatnot. But I just did think it was interesting to just sort of encircle one virtue with these other 2 things. And I'm just thinking, sometimes it's hard enough to find just a single opposite for a virtue. I don't even know if you could find a range to get something like that. I don't know. But anyhow, that has to do with semantics mostly, and the amount of time, Stephen, that you want to spend to build all of that outward.
Depends on how valuable the idea is.
There's a what?
Depends on how valuable the idea is.
Oh, yeah. So extreme faith is, as compared to little.
I can't think of an extreme version of faith that becomes sinful, or an extreme version of love that becomes sinful.
Can't have too much of those.
A level of hope that becomes sinful. I'm so hopeful it's a sin. Like
most bemoan.
Well,
they don't have enough. So.
By nature of what I said, I guess if the second half of my statement is true, then out of necessity, there is no spectrum for those things. If these 3 are the ultimate goods that exist throughout eternity, there's no spectrum. Like, they just are, and they are ultimate and fundamental, and they're just factual. Like, you don't have spectrums of facts. So,
Yeah. Well, I think that on that note, that's a really nice way to end the meeting, actually.
Mercifully so.
Yeah, just okay. We have our 3 ultimates, and we might just take the rest of the year off or something.
Well, it would be time well spent if we took these through to heart.
But anyhow, if nobody else has anything particularly more to add, I'd move that we go ahead and conclude the meeting, because this has definitely been like one of the longer ones.
All right.
But we've had a lot to discuss. No problem. But I would say conclude.
Yep.
Sounds good. Thanks for tuning in.